Professor Chomsky, thank you for joining me on UpFront. You are probably the world's best-known critic of US foreign policy. Right now, the US government is involved in a war to try and degrade and defeat ISIL in Syria and in Iraq. Do you support the US-led bombing campaign of that brutal, horrific group ISIL? And if not, what do you think should be done, if anything, to try and defeat them or at least reduce the threat they pose to the region and to the wider world?
Well, the first thing, it's a monstrosity. There's no question about that. We know its origins. It developed out of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You hit a fragile system with a sledgehammer, you cause all kind of problems. One of the many problems, in addition to hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions of refugees, destroying the country, was inciting a sectarian conflict that may have simmered but barely existed before. And out of this came one monstrosity after another. The latest is ISIL. It has another source, the leading U.S. ally in the region, Saudi Arabia, which has been for years funding extremist jihadi groups and also spreading its extremist Wahhabi Salafi version of Islam through Quranic schools, mosques, radical clerics, and so on. And these things have all fed into ISIS. So the first thing to do is understand it. And there's extensive study of what its appeal is. And it turns out it's disaffected young people living in conditions of humiliation and degradation with nothing in their lives, and most of them don't have much of a background in Islam. Some of them, in fact, are recent converts, but a lot of it's peer pressure, and this is offering them some dignity and hope for their lives.
So you're saying tackle the underlying causes, look at the bigger picture. But I agree with you, and I think a lot of people would say you're right. But in the short term, while you're doing that, that's a long-term operation. In the short term, while they're controlling territory and killing Yazidis and attacking Kurdish towns, how do you stop them?
Well, suppose they're killing Yazidis, so what do? You support the people who are saving the Yazidis, who happen to be on the U.S. terrorist list.
The PKK?
Yes.
The Kurdish
They're the ones who are primarily responsible for saving the Yazidis.
Okay, but if the Americans say we will drop bombs, and they have been working with various Kurdish groups.
With some, but
do you support that? I'm just wondering, you as a critic, do you support that?
Support the working with the Kurds, yeah. The
U.S. Air Force working with the Kurds to defeat ISIL?
To the extent that they are. Supporting the Kurds in Rojava, as they call it, the Kurdish areas of Syria, have defended their territory, seem to be developing as well as you can under these conditions, a fairly decent society, very different than anything else in Syria. Indeed. Yeah, they certainly merit support.
So you don't object in principle, per se, as some on the left do, to any airstrikes by any Western country? You're saying if there's a practical purpose on the day, in alliance with certain people on the ground, you don't object?
I'm not an absolute pacifist. I think there are times when the use of military forces defensively is...
And ISIL is one of them?
Defending the Kurds against the ISIL attacks, yes, that's legitimate. But you have to look at what's going on. There's other groups there that are not very different from ISIL, like the Al-Nusra Front, who are being supported by our ally Turkey and our allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The Kurds have to be defended against them too. What you have is a mixture.
They all claim they're not supporting these groups. They say we're supporting the more moderate Islamist groups like Ahrar al-Sham.
But they say, but in fact, there's no question that they're supporting the Al-Nusra Front, and Ahrar al-Sham is not all that different. And Turkey is openly supporting them.
And on that debate about supporting different groups and factions, do you think it's possible to fight the Assad regime and ISIL and some of these other groups you mentioned at the same time? Or are you one of those people who thinks the West needs to get behind Assad in order to defeat ISIL? Is there a lesser of two evils there?
I mean, Assad is a monstrous regime. However, if you cannot both fight both sides who are attacking one another, you're not going. It's an incoherent strategy. So you have to concentrate what you're doing. You have to isolate. There is an answer to the question of what to do with the Assad regime. It's not bombing Damascus. There's one slim hope, slim but the only one. That's the negotiating process. Either you say, let's not have negotiations, let's all murder each other, or you say, let's have negotiations and see what can come out.
You mentioned Turkey. Turkey has recently been hit by several terrorist attacks on city centres, on tourists. Some have been ISIL, some have been the PKK, the Kurdish separatist group. The Turkish president, Mr. Erdogan, recently attacked you by name, saying it's time for so-called intellectuals like you to, quote, pick a side. You are either on the side of the Turkish government, he said, or you're on the side of the terrorists. You responded by saying Erdogan and Turkey had been aiding ISIL. In the past, you've accused Turkey of carrying out a terrorist war against the Kurds.
He's undoubtedly carrying out vicious, repressive actions attacking the Kurdish population. You can call it what you like.
What would you call it?
I'd call it a murder.
He's a murderer?
Oh, of course. A deeply authoritarian regime, reconstituting policies which in the 90s were totally horrendous. I mean, the 1990s, the Turkish government was carrying out massive state terrorism. Tens of thousands of people killed, thousands of towns and villages destroyed.
You would accept that he would say the people he's fighting are carrying out massive acts of terrorism and murder? You wouldn't deny that?
I don't, and Assad says the same thing about the people he's talking about. I don't pay attention to what leaders of states say.
I'm asking you, though. You would accept the PKK has carried out horrific attacks on civilians?
They have carried out attacks on civilians. Yes, I'm not saying we should give military aid to the PKK. On the other hand, if we are interested in attacking ISIS and saving the Yazidi and saving the Kurds, we can't say we're going to attack them. That's they are...
The lesser of two evils.
Look, I don't know, if you want to rank evils, the United States and Britain are so far higher than anyone else that we can put all the others to the side. Yes, there's plenty of evils in the world, but we have to deal with the world as it exists. If you want to defend the Kurds, you cannot be attacking the Kurds.
On the subject of others, the Turkish president recently got into a spat with Vladimir Putin after the shooting down of a Russian jet in Turkish airspace. Some say, your critics say, you're too soft on Putin. You've said, for example, that it might be wrong for Putin's Russia to back the brutal Syrian government, but it's not imperialism, you said recently. Why isn't it? And are sections of the left guilty of only resisting US imperialism, but not Russian imperialism in the Middle East, in Ukraine and elsewhere?
Sorry, imperialism has a meaning.
Yeah.
When the United States supports Saudi Arabia, it's not imperialism, even though it's supporting a brutal and harsh government. When the United States supports Israel, it's not imperialism, even though it's carrying out atrocities. When Russia supports Damascus, it's not imperialism.
So what is imperialism? How do you define it?
We can define what it is, but it's extending your power over states and territories that you're conquering.
So isn't Russia imperialist then, given what it's done in Crimea?
Is he conquering Damascus?
Has it not annexed Crimea?
Crimea is a totally different issue. We can talk about that if you like. But first of all, let's go back to what you started with, the Turkish jet. That was an extremely provocative act. That jet, according to Turkey, crossed for 17 seconds on its way to continue bombing in Syria, where it was heading and where it was shot, and where it fell after it was shot down. That's an extremely dangerous act.
By the Russians or by the Turks?
By the Turks, using an American jet. That's the kind of thing that could set off a major war. And what were the consequences? The consequences were, as expected, that Russia greatly increased its military forces in the region, put in advanced missiles, sent a missile cruiser. To the, I mean, you don't play games like that.
What about the annexing of the actual land of Crimea?
Sorry, the annexing of land in Crimea, I think, was a criminal act, but it has a history.
But imperialist?
Look, is it imperialism?
You used the definition. You gave me the definition as taking land and conquering.
I'm sorry, I don't call it imperialism when the United States supports the government of Saudi Arabia, Israel, Guatemala,
But you said it is imperialism when you annex land. You said earlier, when you conquer land.
Yes, but we have, that's true, and we have to look at what happened. Crimea has been was handed over to Ukraine
Yes.
by Khrushchev,
Yes.
not by the will of the Crimean
But that was
people.
60 odd years ago. In recent
Sorry.
years, the borders were guaranteed. They were
Yeah,
legal borders, which
That's
Russia
correct.
crossed.
That's why I said it's a criminal act. Now, what happened in the background? In 1990-91, the Soviet Union collapsed. There were two visions of how to proceed. One of them was Gorbachev's.
Yeah.
Let's have a Eurasian security system with cooperation and many central points, Brussels, Moscow, Ankara, and others. The United States had a different position. Let's expand NATO. Let's expand a military alliance to the borders of Russia.
To be fair, a lot of the countries in the region wanted to join
That
NATO
is a different,
democratically.
It's not a matter of being fair. Suppose that the Mexicans wanted to join the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah.
How would the United States react?
We're not, No one's defending the US actions. I'm just looking at the Russian actions. So let me just ask you about Putin. Coming back to Putin, which is how this section began. Do you believe he's only reacting to NATO? He doesn't have expansionist views of his own of recreating a strong Soviet-style Russia? I'm wondering your opinion.
Very little evidence. Look, he's not a nice guy. I don't want to have dinner with him. But these.
But is he an expansionist?
No,
Has he got an expansionist vision?
These moves are largely
Reactive.
Interactive. There are moves on both sides which are interactive. You can't pick one of them and say that's imperialist. There are interactive moves which are dangerous. There's an answer to this. Ukraine can be neutralized. That's the answer. No more talk of NATO enlargement, no talk of, and Ukraine itself is a pluralist country internally. So it can be neutralized, no military alliances, and it can deal with its pluralist internal structure. In that context, Crimea should make its own choices.